but it's going to be an incremental shift over time. And I think that blend of different housing types can actually create economically vibrant, healthy places to live that are interesting and then don't just all look like a cookie cutter suburban development. We've got to grow up. Anchorage has to grow and embrace our identity as a city. We're not a suburb, we're a city. And we need to have housing options for everyone.
Welcome to the East Anchorage Book Club. I'm your host, Andrew Gray. The purpose of this podcast is to tell the stories of Alaskans of interest and importance. Today, our guest is North Anchorage Assembly member Daniel Volland. He was born and raised in Washington State and began coming to Alaska regularly in 2016 to do remote work as an optometrist. After relocating permanently to Anchorage, he became very active very quickly in Anchorage politics and successfully ran for the newly established 12th seat on the Anchorage Assembly in the summer of 2022. Today, he is talking about the Anchorage Assembly's Housing Action Strategic Plan and the Anchorage Housing Action Week that just finished with a big summit on Friday. That summit was held at UAA with the keynote address given by Charles Marohn, who is the land use planner and municipal engineer who advocates for the development of dense towns and the restructuring of suburbia. I bring that up because Mr. Marohn will feature prominently in my conversation with Assemblymember Volland today. Daniel Volland, welcome to the podcast.
It is great to be here with you, Representative Gray.
Who are you? Where are you from?
Who am I? Yeah, so I grew up in sort of South Seattle area in this kind of backwoods area between Federal Way and Auburn on Old Military Road. Grew up in a little farm. We had a goat and we had horses. We raised pigs, had dirt bikes. It was a great upbringing. Went to undergrad at Pacific Lutheran University in Tacoma, Washington, majored in biology, and then went to optometry school in the Portland, Oregon area. Fell in love with all things urban when I was living in Portland, close to downtown, and riding my fixed gear bike all over the city. Moved back after optometry school to Seattle and wanted to live downtown again. So I lived in Capitol Hill and Ballard and just really enjoyed the walkability and the dynamics of being able to go to the museum and restaurants and all the things that downtown had to offer. Took a sabbatical for a year from optometry because I started doing a lot of commercial photography work. Traveled a bunch for that. Was holed up in an Airbnb in the Hollywood Hills, living in LA, and thought, okay, it's time to go back to optometry, to my career that I enjoy and then went to school for. And spent a lot of money pursuing my education. But I wanted to find a way that I could continue some semblance of adventure and maybe have some part-time flexibility. So moved back again to Seattle and started working part-time for a private practice there in Capitol Hill, but also coming up to Alaska every other month to do remote care. So I've been to over 30 communities throughout Alaska to do mobile eye care. We would set up in school classrooms or bingo halls, bowling alleys, hotel rooms, anywhere we could stay warm and dry.
How did you get hooked up with that?
I found that on a random job message board when I was poking around for jobs and wanting to get back into optometry. And it just sounded too good to be true. Take small planes to remote communities. It sounded right up my alley, and hopped on the phone with them and arranged our first trip. And then I did that pretty consistently about every other month for 3 years. Started doing that in 2016. So I was going to communities like Kivalina and Shishmaref and Angoon, and just seeing these
year-round.
Yep, incredibly beautiful places, and all over Alaska. Got to go to Gamble, and a few of my patients went on a whale hunt, and they got walrus, and it's just wow, this is amazing. Was doing that. At the same time I was doing that, I had joined the advisory board of an organization called Arctic Encounter, which is the largest Arctic policy convening in the U.S., started by one of my friends. And so I was also getting this kind of like high-level bird's-eye view of things like climate change and food security and all of the policy issues pertaining to the Arctic. On the same board with me was a guy named Mead Treadwell, who I think many people will recognize that name. Exactly. And so he introduced me to his buddy who was an eye doctor looking to sell his practice downtown. So I ended up going in and meeting with Bill Faulkner, who was on the Anchorage Assembly in the late 80s, early 90s. He served as the chair. He served 3 terms. And just very quickly realized, wow, this is a pretty cool opportunity, an amazing staff, great location downtown. And really, I think I was looking for a way to grow in my career because I had worked in hospital settings. I had worked in a military hospital. I had worked in private practice. Before optometry school, I worked all my summer breaks, Christmas vacations as an optician. And really, there was only one place for me to go in my career, and that was to own my own practice. And that had been a goal of mine for some time, but it was on the back burner. So I thought, okay, I'm going to go through this process. I've never bought a business before. Can I get financing? How can we make this deal happen? And thankfully, it did end up happening. And so I bought the practice at the very beginning of 2019, drove up the Alcan with all my essentials, and the rest is history. But it has been a really fun journey. And now Anchorage is definitely home. And I feel very blessed to have really made a community here.
So you moved here permanently in 2019? How long after you moved here did you start getting involved in politics?
I tried to get involved in a number of things very quickly. And full disclosure, part of that was I wanted to network and be part of the business community and get folks to know who I am. So I joined the Rotary. I joined the board of the Alaska World Affairs Council. I joined the Young Professionals group in the Chamber of Commerce. And then I started getting involved in my community council, South Addition Community Council. And at that time, I was living in the Knick Arms condo tower, 2 blocks from work. It was great. I would walk to work every morning.
So you were renting?
Mm-hmm. So I was renting, yep. Lived there for 2 years before buying my duplex a couple years ago. And that was the first time I had become a homeowner. But yeah, I think—
How old are you?
I'm just turned 39 in September.
So you were 37 when you became a homeowner?
Yep, and until then I had been a renter. Yeah, I think getting involved in my community council was really interesting. I was learning all different kinds of things about land use and transportation. And those are, maybe I'm a nerd, but those are things that really sparked my interest. At the same time, I was attending a lot of the assembly meetings because I was trying to track different items, that may have an impact in our neighborhood. But also that was the height of the pandemic and all the craziness of those meetings. And I remember you were there because there was this meeting where healthcare providers came to testify in assembly chambers about the extraordinary burden that they were under when it came to providing care for COVID patients. And the emergency rooms were full, limited capacity of hospital beds. My sister is a trauma surgeon in the UPMC system in Erie, Pennsylvania, and she was doing that type of care. And I knew just the incredible stress that she was under.
You wrote an op-ed, and that's the first time I saw your name. You wrote it with Paxton.
Yeah, my buddy Paxton, yeah, about how the vilification of healthcare professionals has no place in Anchorage. And I think just seeing the way the healthcare providers were treated, that's the last place that most people want to be. Most people are not me or you, Andrew, where they want to go to assembly meetings and track the legislative process. I think most doctors, after a full shift, they want to go home and be with their families. And just seeing how they were treated by the audience and by members of the mayor's administration and by former colleagues of mine, it was just like, why are we acting like they're the enemy, that they're practicing, or they're essentially accusations of malpractice?
And they were evil.
Right.
And these people had gone to medical school, but these other people had watched some YouTube videos.
Right.
And so now they were convinced that the people with all the education were trying to harm them.
Right.
And were killing people. It was a nightmare.
Just very dystopian. And it was, I think watching that I think it solidified for me, okay, maybe in addition to all of my sort of urbanism interest, maybe there is a role for a healthcare provider on the assembly to weigh in on some of this stuff. And so it's been good to get involved and be one of the co-chairs for the Health Policy Committee. I have an ordinance that is going to, for the first time in code, define qualifications for our chief medical officer, for instance. That'll be before us at our next meeting. But yeah, all that to say, I guess that was my evolution into politics, something that started as me just wanting to get connected in the community and do some community service, put me in that direction.
Cool. You're here today because the Assembly just had Anchorage Housing Action Week.
We did.
And it was, I'll be full disclosure, I went to the summit on Friday.
Yep, I saw you there.
I was not able to attend the events that happened during the week.
Mm-hmm.
And I regret that. It's just the facts of life. But the summit was really great. And I'm so happy that you're here to talk about some of it, because I think that there's really some profound philosophical shifts that need to happen in our community in the way we think about housing and the future of housing in Anchorage.
Right. Yeah. There are some philosophical shifts. And really, we just need to embrace Anchorage as a place of growth and vitality. The way that I like to frame it is housing choice. We need different types of housing for everyone, right? If you are a young person getting your start in the community, or a family who's just starting out, maybe what you need is a 1 or 2 bedroom apartment. If you're a large family with a dog, maybe you need a single family home. If you are downsizing, if you're an empty nester and the kids are gone and you want something that is going to be in a more walkable part of town where you don't have to do the yard work, again, maybe you're back to a 2-bedroom condo or something. And I think we just need a mix of housing types, a diversity of housing options, which is envisioned by our 2040 land use plan, that we would increase in density and also offer a diversity of housing types. But I think we have a ways to go when it comes to actually allowing those things and making it easier for designers, builders, developers to build that type of housing. Anchorage really does have a lack of small and large multifamily new construction. And it's interesting. I'm working on an ordinance to try to make it easier to build small multifamily. I'm on that project with my colleagues, Randy Solt and Kevin Cross. And I believe it since 1991, we have built 30 triplexes.
Wow.
We're just not building those types of units. And for me, we were in our little pre-interview talking about young professionals and where they want to live and small multifamily. One thing that I told you was that I just bought my first home 2 years ago. 2 years ago, I became a homeowner for the first time. I'm 39 years old. I've been practicing optometry since 2011 is when I graduated. And because I own or occupy my duplex, I live up top with my fluffy dog Juniper, and then down below, I have 2 long-term tenants. When I first bought my house, I had 2 tenants long-term move in with me. One was a planner, the other one a speech therapist. So they were with me for 2 years. They were awesome. They moved out in September, and then now I have 2 new tenants. They just moved from New York, and married couple. He will be clerking for one of our judges, and she has her degree in international policy and just got a new job working in that field. And so all that to say, I live in South Addition, a desirable neighborhood, and 3 young professionals get to live close to amenities like City Market or the Coastal Trail, walk downtown, Fire Island Bakery. And I think small multifamily really is a way to increase housing attainability. It makes my housing affordability better to be able to have tenants. And then I think it makes it easier for, again, other folks to rent and truly be part of the community. And I think we want young people, working age people, to move here. Alaska's losing working age population. So how can we welcome more neighbors into our community and into the neighborhoods that we love is something that I'm interested in. I know you're very interested in, I think, in supporting folks in our community who rent. And the fact that we have a low vacancy rate right now and high cost of rent. We just saw reported in the ADN, the largest increase in rent prices in over a decade, right? So that's something I would love to talk about, maybe, is a little bit of the work that you're doing with trying to support folks who rent. And I think that is also one of the philosophical things that we need to tackle.
So I attended the summit on Friday, and the keynote speaker was Chuck Marohn, who authored a book called Strong Towns.
Strong Towns, yep.
And has a podcast called Strong Towns and is a speaker. And he has a new book coming out. I learned that from watching his YouTube videos last night. That's going to be about housing in particular. So I think we got his ideas that'll be in his book. what I heard him say, which really resonated, was that there used to be a sort of ladder of housing where you started off as a renter and then you bought a starter home, which was generally pretty small, very small footprint, affordable. Those don't exist anymore.
Right.
There aren't small homes. Even now you have to do like special permitting to do a tiny home. Whereas in the olden days, that's just what the size of the home was. And I will say my maternal grandparents lived in about an 800 square foot house in a very poor part of town. And that was normal. As a small child, I didn't think of their house as being a tiny home. I thought of their house as being their house. And I could see in my mind that those neighborhoods of houses like my grandparents, those small 800 square foot houses, just don't exist anymore. We've eliminated that from the market. And I want to push back a little bit when you talk about if you have kids and a dog, then you didn't say large single family home, but in my mind, I've heard large single family home because I think people think of a 3,000 to 4,000 square foot home as being the goal. Someday I'm going to have a nice big house with a lot of extra space. And I think that's a philosophical change that needs to happen rather than say, yes, we'll offer all of these choices, but also thinking that I'm going to be successful enough to afford a 4,000 square foot house or bigger. The bigger, the better. Right. I think that bigger or better idea is a product of the 80s and 90s and just the culture that I grew up in. I'm 10 years older than you, that I grew up in, that success is measured by having a nice, big, new home.
Right. I actually think it goes further back than that in the American conscious. I think some people's version of the American dream is the suburban McMansion. And I will say that pattern of suburban sprawl, and Chuck Marohn talks about this in a lot of his presentations. It was post-World War II, this type of aggressive growth that we were having, and it was a type of land use that really is not true to the history of civilization. It was something new and different. And suburban sprawl, and we see a lot of that in Anchorage, where we're growing out, not up, is one of the most expensive ways to run a city. It makes roads more expensive. It makes emergency response more expensive. All of our municipal services, rather than if you have infill and medium to high density, those costs are shared much more broadly.
It makes plowing roads more difficult.
Absolutely. You know what? One of the things before the assembly that I've been critical of is the CASA bond. So I voted to support the Chugach Access Service Area in South Anchorage. We have a lot of people in Anchorage who love to hike or backcountry ice skate or go skiing, and I'm one of them. And I love access to our trails and to Chugach Park. And we all use those roads in South Anchorage, and those roads are, some of them, in a poor state of maintenance, right? But those roads, which now via the Chugach, the CASA bond that we will likely put before voters.
You're saying CASA? What is that?
That's the Chugach Access Service Area.
Gotcha.
So a year ago, the Assembly voted to create a new service area where folks living in the Anchorage Bowl, other parts of Anchorage, would help subsidize those roads along with the local service areas. Now, those LRSAs, those service areas, they don't pay money for our ARDSA road.
I'm so sorry, but you're going to have to not say LRSA and not say ARDSA.
That's one of the hard things about transportation is all the acronyms. So the Anchorage Road Drainage Service Area. Okay. So if there's potholes in Fairview or roads that need repaving in Mountain View, for instance, those things are paid by most of Anchorage.
And I'm just going to say, or the university area, which I think many people are shocked by. The condition of the roads around the university, not on the university, those look great. But you go a couple of blocks away and you have some of the worst potholes, the worst. There is lack of utilities there, just insane things happening just a couple of blocks from the university in my district.
So there are other areas in more rural parts of Anchorage, like on the hillside, for instance, where they don't contribute to those costs in the more urban parts of Anchorage. And very limited is their contribution to like our parks, our local parks, for instance. But their roads, some of them are in a state of disrepair because they can't really afford the upkeep, not only because of the high traffic from folks who want to go hiking or whatever, but when you have 5 McMansions way at the end of a long street, that type of low density makes it very expensive to maintain that infrastructure. You just don't have a tax base to do it.
And I'm going to say this, and those people are some of the people who are so angry about the changes that they see coming down the pike.
When the Anchorage expanded accessory dwelling units where they could be built, and we relaxed some of the standards to make them easier to be built, it was the Rabbit Creek Community Council that really rallied opposition, Rabbit Creek and Rogers Park primarily, because what they called it, what did they say? It would be a random doubling of density through Anchorage. And so, yeah, you have part of the community that I would say consistently advocates against more density, but now wants help paying for their roads. And I think that's the conversation that Anchorage has to have with itself as we continue to grow and we need to provide housing is how do we share those costs and where do we make different transportation investments? Yeah.
When he showed the slides that sort of demonstrated the move towards moving water and sewer further and further out from the center and what those costs were, and saying, when he said in no uncertain terms, Anchorage cannot expand water and sewer anymore. You cannot afford to pay for what you already have.
Right.
I was like, wow, everyone needs to hear this. Everyone needs to hear this. Jeff Landfield promoting the bridge across the Connecticut Harm.
Oh, Jeff is going to love this
needs
podcast.
to hear that, because if you're going to spend, hundreds of millions of dollars, especially billions of dollars to build a bridge and create a whole new development and set it up for water and sewer, electric, just move everything over there, that's billions of dollars that won't be going to the city that we already have that is not being maintained.
My ethos when it comes to transportation, and I know we're jumping topics here, but they are connected, housing and transportation, and how we prioritize our infrastructure investments, how we create neighborhoods that feel vital and safe. Recently, the Assembly had our first ever transportation committee, something that Meg Zalatel and I are starting as the co-chairs. And it was a fantastic committee meeting. We had a packed agenda. We talked about things like taking local control of 5th and 6th Streets downtown. How could we imagine those streets and make them safer and more walkable?
Can we stop and talk about that really quick?
Yes.
So I believe it was in the Berkowitz administration where they timed the lights so that you can move straight through downtown. And I will say, as somebody who occasionally has to get from the Glen Highway to Minnesota, I love that I can drive straight through.
When you hit the green light. Yeah.
But what I learned just from the summit and from watching the YouTube videos is that when you create sort of a freeway through an urban area, you discourage walkability. You discourage businesses from putting their storefront on that street where people just want to drive through like a freeway.
Yep.
You actually impede the type of downtown that you want.
It's bad for economic vitality. And with the Transportation Committee, I have a mantra, and it is the only committee agenda, and I got permission from the chair. I said, I want to put a slogan at the top of our agenda. Other committees don't do this. It's not a normal practice. But the slogan is, Anchorage is a place to get to, not just a place to get through.
And we know that it already is. When they talk about this need of creating a full freeway that connects the Glen to the Seward Highway so that people who are driving from Fairbanks to Homer don't have to wait.
Right.
We know that the vast majority of people using those highways do not drive to Homer. Right. When they're coming in from the Matsu, their destination is the middle of Anchorage. When they're coming from Girdwood, their destination is the middle of Anchorage. Right. Most people driving into the city are going to do something in Anchorage.
we took Chuck Marohn on a walking tour of the Gamble-Ingra corridor. And that, to me, if we really want a big vanity project when it comes to infrastructure and transportation, reimagining that corridor, not the Knick Arm crossing where you're just shuttling people out of town and building a tax base elsewhere. It's reconnecting Fairview. And there's a lot of momentum around that. Right now, the Seward to Glen connection planning and environmental linkages study is happening. And so that's something that's being led by DOT. But the Assembly also fought to support the Fairview Community Council working in tandem with NeighborWorks on getting awarded a novel grant started by US DOT under Secretary Buttigieg. It's called the Reconnecting Communities Pilot Program. And it looks to undo the transportation mistakes of the past and reconnect neighborhoods. I think one of the reasons we don't have housing development happening in Fairview right now is because you have an 8-lane highway couplet bisecting a neighborhood, creating this island that is unsafe.
You're not going to let your kids go out and play in the yard. Like, they're going to end up in the middle of a freeway.
And Fairview has one of the highest populations in Anchorage of folks who don't own a car, people who are dependent on bicycling,
walking across
in
that
their
is a nightmare.
wheelchairs. You look at the sidewalks on the 4-way highway on Gamble. People are trying to go to the grocery store, and they are tiny, thin, and they have utility poles in the middle of them. And then snow berm gets built up because we can't plow our sidewalks. And so that's a sort of ongoing injustice. But if you look back further than that, the reason the highway was, rammed through there in the first place is because Fairview was the redlined housing district. It was where people of color were forced to live because they weren't allowed in other parts of town. And we found an old planning document. Chris Constant, I think, found it, and it said something about how nothing good will ever come of Fairview. And now Fairview's motto that they've embraced is Fairview, where people make the difference. And them being able to get that Reconnecting Fairview grant awarded, $640,000 for a citizen-led effort. Here's the change that we want to see in our community. Here's what we want our roads to look like and what we want our neighborhood to feel like. And the Assembly was able to fund the local match for that. Now we have, it's not just DOT leading the study and doing what they want to do, and they go through a public process too, but it's the citizens themselves, the residents of Fairview themselves who are able to enhance this effort. So I'm very excited about that. But when we took Chuck on that walking tour, he said, "This makes me sad. You've spent a lot of money to just move cars through a place, and in the process made this a really terrible place to be." You have people living in multifamily housing. We say we want multifamily housing, but they're right next to an unsafe highway. And so how can we reimagine that space? And it could look a number of different ways. Maybe it's a road diet and a complete streets approach where you have protected bike lanes and wider sidewalks. Maybe it's a cut and cover, which has been talked about in the past, where you tunnel the highway traffic underneath for a portion and maybe put green space on the top and build vital neighborhoods around it. So for me, that is the project. That's the priority that really could positively impact the entire urban core.
I'll just say, that's your district.
It's my district.
My district is Tudor. And I could basically reiterate everything you just said about Ingra and Gamble. For Tudor, just terrible sidewalks that are not inviting, that do not feel safe along essentially a DOT highway with 45-mile-an-hour speed limit in an area where lots of people cross the road. And we have fatalities to show it. And I think what was interesting was listening a little bit to a podcast episode, which I crammed for this interview. But he was talking about how when there's fatalities, people want to blame it on the lone reckless drivers. But we create an environment that allows a certain type of recklessness to prevail. And
because of the way that we design our street.
The way Tudor is 45 miles an hour through even the parts where there's pedestrians crossing all the time, all day long, all night long. And 45 miles an hour is the speed limit. No, culturally, we drive 5 miles above the speed limit. Driving 5 miles above the speed limit on that between Lake Otis and Elmore on Tudor, if you were driving 50 miles an hour, that is just out of control.
So safety by design, I think, is one of the most important things that we're lacking here in Anchorage. We need to slow our speeds. We also need to revisit and I think potentially rewrite our design criteria manual for our streets. Johns Hopkins University just released a study this month that showed that if we reduce lane width, and this sounds counterintuitive, but let's say you go from a 12-foot lane down to 9 feet, it actually creates increased safety because people
are more careful.
Drive. They don't feel as comfortable. And so I think there's many things we can do. I would like to see more protected bike lanes in Anchorage. And to that end, I worked with our municipal traffic director and for the first time ever to pilot a protected bike lane in the Russian Jack to Mountain View there on Pine Street, that corridor. And I think it was pretty successful. We got a lot of positive feedback, room for improvement for sure. But we are hoping to do the next phase of that pilot study downtown, do a downtown loop. One interesting thing about downtown in particular, it's illegal to ride your bike on the sidewalk. So we require people to ride in the road, but we don't have bike facilities for them on the road. And so you're mixing traffic.
And it's such a scary thing to do.
Absolutely.
You're taught as a cyclist, they're like, own your lane. If there's no bike lane, own the lane. I'm like, oh my God, and have every driver hate you.
It all impacts the system, the whole system, and every district for sure has its needs and its priorities. And right now we have the Metropolitan Transportation Plan, our long-range transportation plan, the 2050 MTP. And I'm one of the assembly members who sits on the policy committee and gets to have a vote. There's 5 members on so AMAPS, I should back up because we want to explain our acronyms. AMAPS is our MPO. Every city above a certain population size has a metropolitan planning organization. And they create the publicly adopted short-term and long-term plans for investments in infrastructure, taking federal money and state money and local money and choosing which projects are going to be prioritized. And so the policy committee has 5 members. It's currently myself, Kevin Cross, who represents Eagle River. The mayor or his designee, Kent Cole, his municipal manager, is currently serving in that role. And then a representative of AKDOT and DEC, Department of Environmental Conservation. And that 5-member voting board gets to vote on how we spend millions and millions of transportation and infrastructure dollars. And how are we going to prioritize that money? Does it go
and are they prioritizing
it?
Investing in what we have, making sure that we're not spending our money on unnecessary projects on the outskirts of town?
I'm trying. One thing that I would like to see on the MTP, and I hope to meet with the mayor soon, and I've been talking with some other elected officials. There is a very unpopular highway expansion project, the Diamond to O'Malley Seward Highway project. Reconstruction. They want to put in a big diverging diamond on one end, and then they want to do a vehicular underpass on the other end and expand the highway by 2 lanes. And it is one of the most expensive highway projects currently programmed on the MTP, $105 million. It's unpopular with the community councils in that area. The Assembly, we have now passed 4 resolutions asking to either right-size or cancel that project entirely. And part of the rationale for that is the traffic demand and population projections that were done in 2006 have actually done the opposite of what was projected. And that's a big issue with transportation planning is we make these wildly optimistic projections about how much traffic we're going to have to handle and how much our population is going to increase. But when the projections when the projections are wrong and the reality is the opposite, we don't recalibrate. We're so far into this project is sunken cost factor where we've already spent this much money on design. We just need to make the project go to completion, despite the fact that project would do exactly what we're dealing with now in Fairview, where it would empty more traffic into a lower income neighborhood. As right of way, they have to remove soccer fields that are really well loved by that community. So here's this controversial project for $105 million, right? In the meantime, we know we have Fairview, And whatever the alternate ends up being, the preferred alternative out of the Pell study, and however we choose to reconnect that neighborhood and reconstruct those streets in a way that is safe for all users, we know it's going to be expensive. Okay. There's also a project in Eagle River, the Artillery Road Interchange, which scored low according to our AMETS criteria, but has tons of public support. It's been Eagle River's main priority for over a decade. And it's a very dangerous traffic pattern that happens there. There's really no non-motorized elements to help. And so if we deprogram the $105 million project that really nobody wants, maybe except for DOT, we could fully fund the Artillery Road enterprise.
That's the main exit for Eagle River? That's really bad.
$33 million.
And then if you go to that church, that Catholic church across the street, and then you exit and you want to go back to Anchorage, you're on a weird road forever. They just did that a few times in the last couple of weeks.
It's really weird. Fund the Eagle River project for $33 million. Then put the rest of that money to Fairview. So we know, okay, when we're finally ready to reconstruct those streets, we're prepared. But that's everything that Strong Towns is talking about, right? Is we do these huge highway expansion projects and then we have to maintain them. And if DOT can't plow our roads in a timely fashion, the roads that exist,
adding more of them is not going to help.
Every extra lane is a lane that must be maintained.
Right. Yeah. That was a big takeaway, is to move away from this ideology that we need to be doing big things, that we need to be having big projects.
Right.
And again, I don't want to just keep, banging away at Alaska landmine, but there's this, I listened to the podcast and there's this drumbeat over time that we used to do big things in Anchorage and now we're not doing them. Alaska used to have great big projects, and where are our great big projects? And what Chuck Marohn said is we need to be doing the next right small thing now, and not waiting for permission and not creating a new task force or a new committee, but just literally doing the next right thing now and not planning for this huge project that we'll spend tons of hours preparing for, allocating tons of resources for, maybe don't even do it. And then, like you said, if we do it, we got to keep paying for that for the rest of our lives.
And who's the mega project serving? Is it people who want to live on the outskirts?
Yeah, why would we be doing big mega projects to get people to leave Anchorage?
Yeah, no, so that one, the Knick arm, I think just needs to die and die forever. But no, I totally agree with you. There are the smaller things that we can do in Anchorage to help create.
I was inspired, and I'm going to say it out loud so that it holds my office accountable. A pet peeve of mine is that the Betty Davis East Anchorage High School swim team cannot have swim practice because the East Anchorage High pool is closed because there's no lifeguard. And I have called and spoken to the school district. I've made phone calls. I've done what I can. My office is going to advertise for that position. My office is we're not going to ask permission. We're not going to create any task force. And I think we're probably going to do a Google banner. I'm trying to figure out where can we hit the most people for the least, but I was we're going to advertise it. And maybe it's not about, do you need a $20 an hour lifeguard job for a few hours a week? It's going to be, can you help this swim team use their own pool that is available and they could use it, but they can't because they don't have a lifeguard? It kills me inside that we're taking them to another high school to practice because they can't use their pool because they don't have a lifeguard. I could say more, but I'm not going to say it on the podcast about how my staff checked and every other pool is advertised and that one's not.
Interesting. Yeah, there are equity issues probably associated with that. But it is about recreational opportunity. Why do people live here? We live here because we love our parks and our trails. And if we aren't creating those opportunities for our youth, they're going to want to leave.
And I guess the point of it is that that seems off subject. But the point is that I have this small thing in the back of my head that's really been bothering me. And I watched this presentation. It was just do the next small thing. And I was that's a small thing that my office alone can do.
A small thing would be for the municipal traffic director. hello, Brad, if you're listening, let's reduce the speed limit on Spenard. We're doing the Spenard Road rehabilitation, and the community is asking for slower speeds. Let's not wait for the completion of yet another study. Make the speed limit slower. There are those small things that we can do.
But the whole study thing annoys me to no end, because we have to wait forever to vote on whether or not to have the study.
Mhm.
And then once we've approved the study, then we have to get the study started.
Mhm.
And then that takes a whole nother time. And then it takes forever to get the results of the study.
Right.
And then once we have the results of the study, we know that now we can show that there actually was a problem, where it was pretty obvious to everyone that there was a problem. And now we'll start talking about how to solve that problem.
And in the meantime, the safety issues are ongoing, right? Yeah. Should we go back to housing?
I want to go back to housing, and I want to talk about the issue in housing in a nutshell. The last 4 years in Anchorage, price of an average home has gone up by $103,000.
Yep.
Rent, as you just pointed out when we were talking before we started, has gone up just extraordinarily. The amount that people are paying in rent over the last few years.
A 5% jump for Anchorage, 7% jump for Alaska as a whole. We're not the only community.
In the last year.
Correct. Yep, largest jump in over a decade. So it is, and you were talking earlier about renters. If folks are struggling to afford rent, they're not going to be able to achieve the dream of home ownership.
Oh my God, if you're struggling to afford rent, you're on the verge of not having a roof over your head.
We heard a presentation at the Housing Summit from UAA about students who are experiencing housing insecurity and food insecurity. They started a food bank at UAA because students aren't able to afford food. And so just the lack of housing attainability, I think, particularly for our young people, we have to continue to have this community dialogue, because I think we have to help an older demographic. And I don't say this to try to sound ageist, but I think there's a lot of people who have owned their home for a long time and were able to purchase that home in a much better financial environment. And
when the culture was guiding them towards a large single family home, and they own that large single family home.
And yeah, if you look at a graph of wages versus housing costs, you're going to see diverging lines, right? And so trying to help longtime homeowners understand just how difficult it is for younger folks to be able to attain housing. I think a lot of millennials and Gen Z folks are really angry and despairing because they feel like it's so out of reach for them. Yeah.
And I'll make the boomer generation angry by saying, in order to get the homes in reach, we need the price of homes to go down. I think what Chuck Marohn said in the YouTube video I watched last night was talking about who benefits from this massive increase in home prices. Well, homeowners benefit.
Right.
I purchased a house in 2019. I thought I was overpaying. 4 years later, it's gone up by 25%. And I'm like, oh my God, thank God I bought it when I bought it. But at the time, I was like, I am paying too much for this duplex. I live, and I do not own, I should restate it. I own my zero lot line. Like somebody else owns the other half.
Yeah.
I don't own the building. I just have half of it. I'll say my prices. So we got ours for about $320,000. And it's now that they're selling in my neighborhood area of duplexes. The half the duplex is selling for $400,000.
Yep.
Half.
Yeah. It's wild. And we have a number of problems, right? We have an aging housing stock. A lot of our housing is really run down. So even if you were able to afford it, you would also have to sink hundreds of thousands of dollars into it to rent it and make it up.
I want to talk about who else is benefiting. So local government benefits. The city of Anchorage benefits a lot when home prices go up a lot because you get more property taxes. If your house is assessed at a higher value, then the amount that the actual number you're paying in property taxes goes up. So that's a benefit.
I think the city of Anchorage, too, will also benefit, though, if we have an increased housing supply, right? And I think part of the conversation is we need more of a supply of housing for folks to be able to attain housing. And I think that's part of the housing ladder. One of the things that I hear from folks is It's only going to be luxury housing and there's not going to be any affordable housing. But when we create all types of different housing supply that, folks who are moving up the housing ladder, that frees up lower rungs on the ladder for people to get into their
100%.
start.
You're not going to get any argument from me.
Right.
I want to go down the whole list of everyone else who benefits from these high floor prices. Banks benefit. In pension funds, investments benefit. A safe investment is real estate. Realtors are benefiting. Developers and contractors, people who are building homes are benefiting. And that was a real eye-opener for me. People who do terrible jobs, build crappy homes, are saved by this massive increase in value. Because if home prices were stagnant and you had this 3-bedroom over here or this 3-bedroom over here, you're going to buy the one that's built well, that that it's got quality materials, it's built right. When the prices are skyrocketing, if this crappily built one is selling for $20,000 less, you'll take it.
Right.
You'll take it. And that developer is not punished in any way, shape, or form, because if they don't buy it now, in 4 months, it's going to be selling for $50,000 more or whatever. It's just
I think your argument is right. You're essentially saying that a more competitive market will mean a better product.
Yes.
Across. Yeah. No, I think that's very true. And
who doesn't benefit? Renters and poor people.
And that
the list of benefit, the list of people who benefit from the upsurge in prices is long. The people who suffer, that list is short.
And you're not only in the here and now are renters being penalized or adversely impacted, harmed even by low vacancy rates and high rates of rent. But they're also harmed in the future, again, from being able to get into homeownership. And I think that is one of the philosophical shifts that Anchorage needs to have, is that there's like this demonization of renters. I was really, disappointed recently. I went to a Rogers Park Community Council meeting, and I was there to present on the home initiative that I'm working on with Anna Brawley and Meg Zolotel to try to consolidate some of our residential zoning. And we gave this whole presentation, and I shared, look, I live in a duplex, and they passed a resolution opposing the home initiative, and one of the reasons listed in the resolution was that it would invite more what they call transient renters into their neighborhood. And so apparently enough people voted to pass the resolution. They want to keep renters out of their neighborhood. And until 2 years ago, that would have been me. You wouldn't have wanted me to live in Rogers Park. And this just aversion to renters. And again, I think it goes back in decades to some of our ingrained
and who are renters?
Philosophy.
Renters are people who can't afford to buy a house. Renters are people with less income or younger people. And so really it's saying we don't want young people and we don't want poor people.
And I think going back, Rogers Park, if you look at the history, had deed restrictions that said people of color could not purchase homes in that neighborhood. So it is not that far back that we have these patterns of racial injustice built into our housing market that I think we're still experiencing echoes of today. And that, again, is the conversation that one of the questions that I am encouraging all my community councils, and I have 11 community councils in my district, the most of any district. And I think the question really has to be, I love my neighborhood, all the things that make it great. I love living here. How can I welcome more neighbors to live here and love it too? And it's going to be incremental. If we pass the triplex, fourplex ordinance that I'm working on, if we pass the home initiative, the reality is we're not going to see overnight all this construction of new large multifamily. You're going to see maybe one project a year close to your neighborhood, maybe a triplex here, a fourplex there, a townhome there, maybe a large multifamily. There's just not many developers who are building large multifamily right now because it's very hard to make it pencil. That was some of the feedback that we heard at the Housing Summit. But it's going to be an incremental shift over time. And I think that blend of different housing types can actually create economically vibrant, healthy places to live that are interesting and they don't just all look like a cookie cutter suburban development. We've got to grow up. Anchorage has to grow and embrace our identity as a city. We're not a suburb, we're a city. And we need to have housing options for everyone.
Two things. Back to the not wanting transient renters. I think there's a cultural shift about 90, 100 years ago, leading up to the Great Depression and before that, a culture in America of renting out your bedroom and for the night, providing breakfast the next morning, that was seen as pretty normal. And we don't do that anymore. So I think that it might have been easier to be unhoused 100 years ago. Actually, I'll just say it. It was easier to be unhoused. There were more options, and there was a culture that kind of said, yeah, sometimes this happens, and you charge what they can pay. You're not really making a huge profit, but it's better than nothing because that room was going to make nothing last night if no one had been there. And so I think has been this cultural shift. But I'll say that Karen Bronga talking at the housing conference, Assemblymember Karen Bronga, about her and her husband having a larger home and making sort of an ADU in the house, not constructing, but actually saying there's an extra bedroom down there. There's some extra space. We'll put like a little kitchenette in. We'll make it so they have their own entrance inside their house.
And I believe with the idea to have her mom.
That's what she was. Yes.
And I think that's part of what we hope to see with the accessory dwelling units is more people being able to age in place, sort of supported by their family members, that multi-generational housing. And her presentation was really interesting because she went through a number of hurdles and it's still.
She also thought no one would want to live in the house with her. And she was like, I'm just shocked that there's people applying that want to, because it's not a separate apartment. It's one house.
Yeah, no, I think accessory dwelling units are fantastic. I think you were asking about welcoming other community members into your own home and what that can look like. And yeah, it's interesting. Lack of housing attainability is directly connected to housing insecurity, which is directly connected to homelessness. Most folks are 2 paychecks away from housing insecurity. Unpaid medical debt is the number one cause of bankruptcy. But for the grace of God, go I. We all could find ourselves in a situation where we lose our housing. Folks who are victims of domestic violence can lose their housing. And so how can we create housing options for those people, I think is very important. And also, how can we house homeless people? And that's something that the Assembly has really been working aggressively toward in converting hotels to permanent supportive housing, for instance. One of my first co-sponsored appropriations when I was newly elected was helping close the sale of the guest house downtown, which is extremely low income housing and is very well run and operated. And so I think we need to make those types of investments. I just don't accept that we do nothing or that we leave people to fend for themselves. And alongside that, we also need to address things like mental health resources that are needed and substance abuse recovery programs that are needed and make those investments. For instance, the Assembly helped fund the Providence Crisis Stabilization Center, which will be coming online soon, where people can have walk-in mental health care. We are funding the mobile crisis team under the fire department to be able to respond if somebody is having a mental health emergency. And yeah, it's all part of housing. When folks are stably housed, that can lead to other positive health outcomes.
I want to go back, like we're getting towards the end of our time, and I just want to go back to that whole idea of it's not just one community council, it's just not one neighborhood that's resistant to change. And the one constant in life is change. Neighborhoods don't want to see a massive grand scale change happen in an instant. And the good news is that very rarely happens. People need to accept that there's going to be changes in their neighborhood as time goes by. Every neighborhood needs to evolve and change. And what do you want your neighborhood to be changing and evolving? How do you want it to be changing and evolving? One thing I got from Chuck Marohn is he said, look, you've got all these communities in your city. Some are going to be extraordinarily resistant. Don't fight them. Put your resources, your financial resources, your investment in the areas that want it. Don't fight this fight. Don't force this community over here. They don't want to make any changes. They want everything to stay exactly the way it is. Make everything else great.
Right.
Make people want to not live there. Make them want to live in the new. Make them want to live. Make Anchorage want to move to the Ingra-Gamble corridor. Make everyone want to live there because those people are welcoming that investment.
Absolutely. I think we do have to be conscious of gentrification and displacement, right? And I think I've been looking at studies because I want to make sure that there's opportunity for growth, but also for people to stay in their neighborhood. And I think when we see a lot of development of larger multifamily, it actually allows for people to stay in their part of the community.
Like putting the starter homes there.
Yep. And then for me, increasingly, I think, okay, absolutely what you're saying. And I think Fairview, again, is a perfect example. In their neighborhood plan, they actually welcome increased density and thoughtful development. And I am increasingly of the mindset that transportation and infrastructure investments need to follow density. If there's a part of town that doesn't want to welcome that, then we have to prioritize the parts of town that do and have just a growth development mindset, not a transit supportive corridor study, which is something that Chuck talked about in his presentation in response to somebody who asked a question, but just that allowing for that organic growth where it's happening and capitalizing on that.
Right. 1 second left. The draft housing action strategic plan for the Anchorage Assembly is out. It was released at the summit. I assume they can find it on the Assembly website?
Yeah, I believe it's on, if you go to muni.org and you hit the Assembly icon, then we have a web page on our Assembly website link on our Assembly webpage that goes to everything we're doing on housing, and it has a link to the strategic plan. And I got to give big props to my Assembly colleague, Anna Brawley. She's a beast. She really did the lion's share of work on this. But what she did is she looked back and looked at all the policy directives of the Assembly for the last few years, everything we've been working on for housing. Housing has been the Assembly's priority for the last couple of years.
I'm just going to say the goals really fast.
Yes.
Because it's not, and it's a very well-written, easy-to-read plan. The front page alone just gives you what it is and what you're trying to do. The goals: number 1, increase the supply of housing units for sale and for rent. Number 2, diversify the housing market, the housing types, sizes, price points, locations, and ownership models.
Which is all supported by the 2040 Land Use Plan.
Number 3, increase the share of resident-occupied housing throughout the year and reduce the number of vacant units. That's talking about a bill I have.
Yeah.
Number 4, reduce housing cost burdens and ensure safe, affordable, permanent housing for all residents. And number 5, make the municipality a better partner in the development process. And I think that's talking about lowering barriers to new types of building, to building in general. One thing that Chuck Marohn said that he wished that there was a way to walk into to eliminate the long permit process. That if somebody has a completed building application, they should be able to walk in and a few hours later come out with a permit. He said, but that's just not the way it works. That we need to make it so that when you've done your homework, you're able to do what you want to do. You know you're following the code. That we have these barriers to getting started.
Totally.
And the bigger it is, the longer it takes, and it's just so upsetting.
And if you haven't been through that process before, or let's say you're not a large developer with all this capital and this is not your profession, I'm interested in how can we support owner builders, right? Whether that's somebody who wants to build an ADU or if it's somebody who wants to build a fourplex on a lot, how can we assist them in going through that process? And
because they're not a builder, they don't know the code, they don't know the rules.
And how can we give builders, whether they be owner builders or developers, how can we give them more surety that their projects will be able to reach completion? For $1,000, somebody can file an appeal and try to oppose a development close to their neighborhood, right? And that can often impact projects in such a detrimental way. It can add over $100,000 to a project. It can add over a year timeline to a project. And I think that also gets that. How can we be a better business partner? How can we I would be interested personally in increasing that appeal fee, because anyone just being able to file an appeal for $1,000 because they don't like a project for whatever reason, but then that could potentially keep the project from penciling. We're stuck with no more housing than what we had previously. So there's a lot that we can do on that side of things.
I guess to recommend a book to our listeners.
Strong Towns.
Yeah,
would be a great book. I'm also reading a fantastic book right now called Happy City that talks about how things like active transportation and shared communal spaces, parks and plazas and those type of things actually make people happier. Let's see, what other books? Are you reading any good urbanism books right now?
No, I'm always reading books for my podcast interviews with authors. So I'm not reading about housing right now. I should be, but I'm not.
Yeah. I think that the more that we are inviting the community into these conversations, we can all get on the same page for growth. And there's an opportunity that we have to increase the number of dwelling units while also making our neighborhoods, particularly the infrastructure, making it a safe place to be and protecting those things about our neighborhoods, particularly the shared space that we all love.
I was going to say about the municipality being a better partner. So the government actually is here to help you. The government's not here to say no. And I think like we have reached a place where the expectation and the assumption is the government is going to say no in requiring all of these papers and permits and processes.
And being willing to take innovative approaches.
Assemblymember Volland, thank you so much for being on the podcast.
Thank you.
Today.
This has been really fun.
I am including a link to the Anchorage Assembly's housing focus page. I am also including links to the book Strong Towns by Charles Marohn and a link to the book Happy City, Transforming Our Lives Through Urban Design by Charles Montgomery, both books just mentioned by our guest Daniel Volland. For any renters out there who might be listening, I am hosting a constituent event this Thursday, November 9th from 5:30 to 6:15 p.m. on Zoom. We will be discussing renters' rights. Questions such as, how much can my rent be raised? How do I get my deposit back? What do I have to do to get evicted? The person answering these questions will be fair housing expert attorney Daniel Coons, and the Zoom link for that meeting will be in the show notes as well. Thanks for listening. If you like what you heard, please subscribe, rate, and review us. To contact me, email eastanchoragebookklubb@gmail.com.